The world above had ended in a way that was as sudden as it was complete. Few survivors remained to witness the final moments, and even fewer understood what had truly happened. The surface of the earth had become a wasteland, uninhabitable, toxic, and utterly devoid of life. For those who had managed to find refuge before the collapse, survival meant isolation, and isolation meant the colony. Buried deep beneath the earth, the colony was a marvel of human ingenuity, a fortress designed to outlast time itself. It was conceived in secret, constructed by a nameless organization that had seen the end coming long before anyone else. The colony was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where the remnants of humanity could endure, perhaps even rebuild when the time was right. But to those who lived within its steel walls, it was something else entirely. The air inside the colony was cold and sterile, filtered through a complex system that kept out the poisons of the world above. The corridors, narrow and dimly lit, wound through the bunker like the veins of a giant beast, connecting the various compartments that made up the colony's intricate ecosystem. Everything was regulated: air, water, food, even the cycle of artificial light that mimicked the long-lost day and night. Nothing was left to chance. At the heart of the colony's life was the Council, a group of 5 individuals who ruled with absolute authority. Each member of the Council had been chosen for their expertise. One, a former military strategist, another a scientist, a third an engineer, and so on. Together they made every decision, from resource allocation to the enforcement of discipline. Their word was law, and to disobey was to invite punishment that was swift and severe. Nadia had grown up within these walls, never knowing the world that had existed before the fall. For her, the colony was the only reality she had ever known. She had been born into a time of strict order, where every action was dictated by the Council's mandates, and where fear of the unknown kept everyone in line. From a young age, she had learned to follow the rules, to suppress her curiosity, and to accept the Council's version of the truth. But even as a child, Nadia had found it difficult to silence the questions that bubbled up inside her. She often found herself staring at the steel ceiling of her small compartment, wondering what lay beyond. What had the world been like before? What had driven humanity to such a desperate fate? And most importantly, what was the real nature of the threat that the Council insisted lurked just outside the colony's reinforced doors? The Council had always been vague about the exact nature of the danger. The unseen enemy, they called it, a force so powerful and malevolent that it had wiped out nearly all life on Earth. The Council's broadcasts, delivered weekly to the colony's inhabitants, were filled with warnings of what would happen if anyone ever attempted to leave the safety of the bunker. They described horrors, mutated creatures, deadly pathogens, and environmental collapse so complete that nothing could survive for long on the surface. These broadcasts were delivered with the same detached, clinical tone each time, as if the Council were discussing nothing more than the day's rations. The fear they instilled, however, was very real. No one questioned the Council's authority, and no one dared to disobey their commands. To do so would be to risk exposure to the very dangers the Council described, and that was a fate worse than death. Yet, as Nadia grew older, the fear that had once controlled her began to give way to something else: doubt. She noticed things that others seemed to overlook, small inconsistencies in the Council's explanations, strange gaps in the history they provided. The more she thought about it, the more she began to suspect that the Council was hiding something. But About what? And why? Nadia's curiosity led her to the archives, a section of the colony that was rarely visited by others. Here, the records of the old world were stored, books, documents, and digital files, all preserved for reasons that no one could quite explain. The council had decreed that access to these records was restricted, allowed only to those with special permission. But Nadia, with her quiet demeanor and sharp mind, had managed to find ways around the restrictions. She spent hours poring over the old texts, looking for clues that might explain the world that had come before. What she found was both fascinating and disturbing. The more she read, the more she realized that the Council's version of history was incomplete, full of omissions and contradictions. There were references to conflicts and disasters that didn't match the Council's narrative, mentions of technologies and societies that had been erased from memory. It was as if the world had been deliberately forgotten, rewritten by the Council to suit their needs. But the more she uncovered, the more dangerous her position became. Nadia knew that if the Council discovered what she was doing, the consequences would be dire. Still, she couldn't stop. The truth, whatever it was, seemed to be just out of reach, and she was determined to find it. Her doubts, however, did not go unnoticed. The Council had eyes and ears everywhere, and they were quick to act when they sensed dissent. Nadia began to feel their presence more acutely. The guards who seemed to linger too long in the corridors, the surveillance cameras that followed her every move. The pressure was mounting, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before the Council took action. As she lay in her bed at night, staring at the unyielding metal above her, Nadia couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. The colony, once a place of safety, now felt like a trap, a prison from which there was no escape. The Council's grip on the population was tightening, and the walls seemed to be closing in around her. But even as fear gnawed at her insides, she knew that she had to keep searching for the truth. Because somewhere, buried beneath the lies and the fear, was the answer she sought, and Nadia was determined to find it, no matter the cost. The rhythm of life in the colony was as steady and unchanging as the hum of the air filtration systems. Each day was carefully choreographed by the Council, a blend of work, controlled social interactions, and periods of rest, all designed to maintain the fragile balance of their isolated world. But that balance was shattered the day the first body was found. It was early morning when the alarm sounded, a shrill noise that rarely broke the monotonous silence of the bunker. Nadia, who had been in the middle of her daily routine, felt a jolt of fear as the sound reverberated through the narrow corridors. Everyone around her froze, their faces a mixture of confusion and dread. Alarms meant something had gone wrong, something serious. And in the colony, where every detail of life was meticulously managed, the smallest deviation from the norm was enough to send waves of panic through the population. The whispers began immediately. "Someone's dead," Nadia overheard as she made her way through the crowd, gathering near the central hub of the colony. Her heart pounded in her chest. Death was not common here. In fact, it was almost unheard of. The medical facilities were advanced, and the population was small and carefully monitored. For someone to die suddenly was an anomaly that no one had anticipated. The first victim was a middle-aged man named Victor, a quiet worker who had spent most of his life maintaining the colony's water purification systems. His body was discovered in his quarters, slumped over a table, his face twisted in an expression of terror. No one knew how he had died. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, nothing to indicate that anything was amiss, except for the look of sheer horror frozen on his face. The council acted quickly, sealing off Victor's quarters and ordering an immediate investigation. But as the days passed, more bodies were found, each one as inexplicable as the last. The deaths were scattered, unpredictable, and utterly terrifying. There was no pattern that anyone could discern, no common link between the victims except for the fact that they were all residents of the colony. Panic spread like wildfire. People who had once lived in a state of resigned acceptance now found themselves gripped by fear. Conversations were hushed, eyes darted nervously, and the usual routines were disrupted by a growing sense of unease. The air, once simply cold and sterile, now seemed thick with a suffocating tension. Every corner of the colony felt unsafe. Every shadow harbored a potential threat. The council, typically aloof and distant, made an unprecedented appearance in the colony's central hall. Their faces were grim, their voices calm, but tinged with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. They stood on the raised platform, looking out over the gathered crowd, and delivered their verdict. The deaths were the result of an external force. The unseen enemy, which had long been the source of whispered fears, had found a way into their sanctuary. "We are under attack," the council's leader, a severe woman named Dr. Mercer, declared, her voice echoing through the hall. "The enemy has infiltrated our walls. This is a time for unity, for obedience. We must stand together, or we will fall." The words struck a chord of terror in the hearts of the colony's inhabitants. The unseen enemy was a concept they had all grown up with, a nebulous threat that had always been just beyond their reach, kept at bay by the safety of the bunker. But now it seemed that safety had been breached. The council's response was swift and severe. They imposed new rules, tighter curfews, increased surveillance, and a demand for absolute obedience. Fear became the colony's new currency, traded in every glance, every whispered conversation. Nadia listened to Dr. Mercer's speech with a growing sense of dread. The explanation seemed too convenient, too neatly packaged to account for the chaos that had erupted in their midst. Her instincts, honed over years of quiet observation, told her that something was not right. The deaths were too sudden, too calculated, and the council's reaction too immediate. It was as if they had been prepared for this, as if they had been waiting for an opportunity to tighten their grip on the population. Driven by a gnawing suspicion, Nadia began her own investigation. She retraced the victims' last steps, searched their quarters for any clues that might explain their deaths, and quietly questioned those who had known them. What she found only deepened her unease. The victims, she discovered, had all been people who had, in one way or another, shown signs of dissent. Small acts of rebellion that had gone unnoticed by most, but not, it seemed, by the council. Victor, the first victim, had recently spoken out against the food rationing, questioning why the supplies seemed to be dwindling faster than expected. Another victim, a young woman named Elise, had been caught trying to access restricted areas of the colony. A third, an older man, had been heard expressing doubts about the council's narrative of the world above. Individually, these actions were minor, easily dismissed as the frustrations of people living under constant pressure. But together they formed a pattern that Nadia could not ignore. As she pieced together the fragments of information, a horrifying realization began to take shape in her mind. The deaths were not random, and they were not the work of some unseen enemy. They were executions, carried out with precision and designed to look like the result of external threats. The council was not protecting the colony from danger. They were manufacturing it. The implications were staggering. If Nadia's suspicions were correct, the very people who claimed to be their protectors were, in fact, the true enemy. But the question remained, why? What could the council possibly gain from such a horrific deception? The more she uncovered, the more isolated Nadia felt. She could trust no one, not even those she had once considered friends. The fear that gripped the colony now extended to her own thoughts, each one a potential threat to her survival. She knew that if the council discovered her investigation, her fate would be sealed. But the need for answers, for truth, was a force that she could not resist. As the number of deaths continued to rise, so did Nadia's resolve. She would find out the truth, no matter the cost. The safety of the colony was an illusion, a veil that had been pulled over their eyes to hide the real danger, one that lay not outside their walls, but within them. The darkness that had begun to consume the colony was not the result of some external force, but of a rot that had festered from the inside, hidden beneath layers of lies and fear. And Nadia knew that she was the only one who could expose it. But as she prepared to take the next step in her investigation, a cold realization settled over her. The council was watching. They always were. And now, more than ever, she had to be careful. Because in the colony, the truth was not just dangerous, it was deadly. Nadia's world had become a shadowy maze of secrets and lies, each step she took revealing new layers of the dark truth that lay at the heart of the colony. The once familiar corridors of the bunker now felt like the winding pathways of a nightmare, where danger lurked around every corner and trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had become adept at moving unseen, slipping through the colony's surveillance nets, avoiding the watchful eyes of the council's enforcers. Her investigation had turned into an obsession, driving her deeper into the forbidden zones of the bunker, where only the council and their most trusted aides were allowed to tread. It was during one of these covert excursions that Nadia found herself standing before a door she had never seen before. Hidden in a dark corner of the colony's lower levels, it was marked with a symbol she had come to dread, the emblem of the council. The door was locked, of course, but Nadia had learned to carry the tools necessary to bypass such obstacles. Her hands trembled as she worked, the echo of her own heartbeat loud in the silence. When the door finally clicked open, Nadia hesitated, a cold shiver running down her spine. She had a premonition that whatever lay beyond would change everything she thought she knew. Steeling herself, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was large, dimly lit by the cold glow of fluorescent lights. It was nothing like the rest of the colony. The air was stale, carrying a faint chemical odor that made her skin crawl. The walls were lined with cabinets and counters, all meticulously organized, filled with vials, syringes, and medical equipment. But it was the far side of the room that caught Nadia's breath in her throat. There, laid out on metal slabs, were the bodies of those who had recently died, the victims whose deaths had thrown the colony into chaos. Victor, Elise, and others she recognized, all of them pale and lifeless, their faces still twisted in the expressions of terror that had haunted Nadia's nightmares. She felt her knees weaken, a wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm her. But she forced herself to move forward, to understand what she was seeing. On a nearby table, Nadia found a series of documents, lab reports, medical records, all meticulously detailed. As she scanned the papers, the horrifying truth began to crystallize in her mind. The victims had not died from natural causes, nor had they been killed by some external force. They had been poisoned, their deaths carefully orchestrated by the Council to appear as though they had succumbed to some mysterious enemy. Her hands shook as she read further, uncovering the twisted logic behind the Council's actions. The poison used was a slow-acting agent, one that caused the victims to suffer in their final moments, amplifying the terror that was etched into their faces. The Council had selected their victims carefully. Those who had shown signs of dissent, questioned authority, or simply been deemed unnecessary for the colony's long-term survival. It was not just about control, it was about creating fear. By staging these deaths as the work of an external enemy, the Council reinforced their narrative of a world too dangerous to survive in without their protection. They used the deaths to justify tighter restrictions, increased surveillance, and the ruthless elimination of any perceived threat to their power. But the documents revealed something even darker. This was not the first time the Council had done this. There were records of similar incidents stretching back years, all following the same pattern. Whenever dissent began to stir within the colony, a wave of mysterious deaths would follow, always blamed on some outside force, always resulting in a renewed call for obedience. Nadia's breath caught in her throat as she realized the full extent of the Council's deception. They had been systematically reducing the population, culling those who threatened their authority, while keeping the rest in line through fear and manipulation. The colony was not a sanctuary, it was a prison, one where the inmates were slowly being led to slaughter. As she stood there, staring at the bodies, the full weight of what she had discovered threatened to crush her. The Council had turned the colony into a nightmarish experiment in control, and the people she had grown up with were nothing more than pawns in their twisted game. And now that she knew the truth, she realized that she was in more danger than ever. Nadia's first instinct was to flee, to get as far away from that room as possible, but she knew there was no escape. Not yet. She had to find a way to expose the Council, to bring their crimes to light. But how could she do that when the entire colony was under their control, and when anyone she confided in could be working for them? The enormity of the task ahead of her was staggering. She had to gather evidence, find allies, if there were any left, and somehow get the truth to the people. But time was running out. The Council was thorough, and it wouldn't be long before they realized what she had uncovered. When that happened, she would become their next target. Her mind raced as she backed away from the bodies, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to act quickly before the Council could tighten their noose around her. But even as she turned to leave the room, she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. She would have to navigate the web of lies and deception that the Council had woven, all while keeping her true intentions hidden. As she slipped back into the shadows of the colony, the weight of her discovery pressed down on her. The fear that had once driven her to seek the truth now threatened to paralyze her. But she couldn't afford to hesitate, not now. The lives of everyone in the colony depended on what she did next. With a final glance at the door she had just exited, Nadia steeled herself for the battle ahead. The Council had underestimated her, but they would not make that mistake again. She was no longer just a curious girl poking around in the archives. She was a threat, one that they would stop at nothing to eliminate. But Nadia knew that she could not allow fear to win. She had uncovered the truth, and now it was up to her to ensure that it didn't die with her. The horror she had discovered in that hidden room would not be in vain. She would expose the council, no matter the cost, because in the colony, the truth was the only weapon she had left. Nadia's mind was a blur of fractured memories and half-forgotten dreams. She was no longer sure how much time had passed since she first uncovered the horrifying truth about the colony. Days, weeks, months, it all blended together in a haze of pain and confusion. She could no longer trust her own thoughts, her sense of self eroding under the relentless pressure of the council's manipulation. They had caught her, of course. She had known it was only a matter of time. Despite all her precautions, despite the care with which she had tried to move through the shadows, the council had eyes everywhere. The moment they realized she knew the truth, they had descended on her like vultures, swift and merciless. Her capture had been the beginning of a nightmare that she could not escape. The council's methods were refined, perfected over years of practice. They didn't simply kill dissenters, they broke them, remolded them into obedient shadows of their former selves. Nadia had resisted at first, clinging to the hope that she could somehow fight back, but the council's tools were insidious. They used drugs, psychological manipulation, and isolation to wear her down, to strip away the layers of her identity until she was no longer sure who she was or what she had been fighting for. She had moments of clarity, brief flashes when she remembered the truth. Why she had started her investigation, the things she had discovered in that hidden room. But those moments were fleeting, drowned out by the overwhelming tide of the council's lies. They filled her mind with new memories, false memories, until she couldn't tell what was real and what had been implanted. They whispered to her in the dark, voices that told her she had been wrong, that the council was her savior, her protector, that without them, she would be nothing. And slowly, agonizingly, Nadia began to believe them. It was easier that way, easier to let go of the struggle, to stop fighting against the tide, easier to forget the faces of the dead, the terror that had once driven her to risk everything. The council offered her peace, a return to the numb existence she had known before. All she had to do was accept their version of the truth, to surrender the last vestiges of herself. In the end, Nadia could no longer remember why she had resisted in the first place. The council had taken everything from her, her memories, her will, her very sense of self. She was no longer Nadia, the curious young woman who had dared to question the world around her. She was something else now, something cold and empty, a tool in the hands of those who had shaped her. They didn't kill her, they didn't need to. Nadia was far more valuable to them alive, as a living symbol of their power. They gave her a new role, a new purpose, one that she accepted without question. She became their enforcer, a silent, unyielding presence in the colony, her eyes now filled with the same lifeless obedience that she had once seen in others. The people she had once known looked at her with fear and pity, but no one dared to speak of what she had become. They saw the council's victory in her hollow gaze, the proof that resistance was futile. The colony continued as it always had, the rhythms of life unchanged, the council's grip as tight as ever. The deaths were fewer now, but the fear remained, deeply ingrained in the minds of the population. The council's broadcasts spoke of the ongoing threat from the unseen enemy, reminding everyone that their survival depended on absolute loyalty. And now Nadia was their enforcer, the one who ensured that loyalty, her presence a constant reminder of what happened to those who dared to question. In the deepest recesses of her mind, buried under layers of manipulation, a fragment of the old Nadia still existed. But it was a small, fragile thing, drowned out by the overwhelming tide of the Council's control. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when she was alone, that fragment would stir, whispering of the things she had once known, the truth she had once sought. But those whispers were faint, quickly silenced by the overwhelming force of the new reality that had been imposed on her. And so Nadia was lost to herself, to the truth, to the hope of ever escaping the prison that the colony had become. The Council had won, and their victory was absolute. But even as the final vestiges of her old self faded into darkness, the story of the colony was far from over. The seeds of doubt that Nadia had planted during her investigation had not been entirely in vain. Unseen by the Council, hidden within the shadows of the bunker, there were others who had begun to question, to wonder if there was more to their world than what they had been told. Small acts of defiance, whispers of rebellion. They were the embers of a fire that had not yet been extinguished. And perhaps one day those embers would ignite into something more. Perhaps in the distant future, someone else would pick up where Nadia had left off, would find the courage to seek the truth, to challenge the Council's lies. But for now, that future remained uncertain, a distant hope in a world ruled by fear. As Nadia stood at the center of the colony, her eyes cold and empty, she was no longer the hero of her own story. She was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of challenging those in power. And as the lights dimmed and the artificial night descended on the colony, the darkness that had claimed her spread ever further, engulfing all that it touched. In the end, the colony was not just a place. It was a state of mind, a prison from which there was no escape. And Nadia, once so full of fire and determination, was now its most tragic victim. The last echoes of her former self faded into the silence, leaving nothing behind but the hollow shell of what she had once been. The truth had been buried, and with it, the last hope of freedom. The story was over, but the nightmare of the colony would continue, unchallenged, unbroken, and unstoppable.